Welcome to All About Capital Campaigns, a podcast that provides fuel for your nonprofit's growth. Each week, hosts Andrea Kilstedt and Amy Eisenstein, co-founders of the Capital Campaign Toolkit, provide practical tips about raising more money for your nonprofit organization. The Capital Campaign Toolkit is a support system for nonprofit leaders who are running capital campaigns. At capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, you can download a step-by-step guide for your capital campaign and get many other free resources. This podcast is recorded on a live webinar every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join the live session and get your questions answered by signing up today at toolkittalks.com.
Andrea, why don't you start us off with our topic for today, which is how to connect with donors in the summer.
Yes. So here's a confession to make. So it's my job this week to write a blog post about this subject. And I am interested in having you help me figure out what to write. So we want to know, what are you thinking about how you might use the summer months to connect to your donors, right? It feels like the summer months are a little easier, both internally, right? It's before you start the fall craziness, and for your donors who may be on vacation or who may be a little easier in their minds over the summer as well. So what kinds of things might you do to get in touch with your donors? And, as I thought about this topic, Amy, one of the questions that it rose for me was, how do you characterize the different relationships you have with donors? Because that would make a big difference about how you get in touch with them over the summer. And probably there are some donors with whom you actually have become friends. That tends to happen. I mean, when that happens, of course, it's a dual relationship. You are both representing your organization and you are a fundraiser. But over time, over years, there are some donors, though not all of them, that with whom you may have developed a real lovely personal relationship. And when that's the case, then you can reach out in a different way. When that's not the case, when it really is you are the development director, and when you reach out, it's about business, then you're going to have to connect with them in other ways. So, because I was thinking, well, how would I connect with donors? And of course, the people that come to my mind are the people with whom I'm friends. Right?
Yeah, I want to caution you and everybody, Andrea. It is a fine line between, you really sometimes do enjoy your donors on a personal level. But it is tricky to think about, what friends means in the context of a donor relationship. Will that relationship carry on once you're no longer at the organization? So, I think occasionally that happens. I think for the most part, it doesn't. You're friends while you're at the organization. So I want to distinguish between when you're truly friends that carries on after, perhaps. And, it does happen from time to time. And, as long as everybody's comfortable with it and the boundaries are set, it's probably okay. But for the most part, I think people are friends within the context of the organization and within the context of your roles. But that being said, there are people that you are much friendlier with, and it's much easier to connect with and get together with. I love this. Who's saying this? Somebody in the chat is saying, hoping to connect with a donor at a local ice cream shop. So wonderful, right? Instead of going for coffee or lunch, you can stop for frozen yogurt or ice cream. I think that sounds fabulous. All right. I didn't mean to cut you off, Andrea. Did you have other thoughts on this?
Perhaps there really are three categories of donors, because I do think it happens that you become friends with donors who actually stick with you and the organization if you were to leave, right? So I think that it's maybe a small group, but one worth thinking about. Then I think there are donors with whom you have a strong and solid and good relationship, that it's not a friendship, right, that won't stick with you beyond the organization. But it is certainly a professional friendship, and we all have lots of professional friendships. And then there are donors that you really don't know, or you don't know them well. Your relationship is fully professional. I think it's worth thinking about those categories and how you reach out to people in those categories. So one thing that comes to my mind is that you may know through various ways that a number of your donors go, for example, to Southampton in the summer, right? That they go to the same community. And sometimes people in an organization actually do tend to go to the same community in the summer. You could actually suggest that some of them get together. You could you could ask one of them to host a little gathering of people who were like-minded and supported the organization. So that's an idea I think might work if the people who support your organization, if you know that some of them are going to be in the same place over the summer, right? Some of them go to Maine. Some of them go to Bar Harbor, Maine, right? you might want to host something there or do something there. What comes to your mind, Amy?
Well, I want to read Trinkar's thoughts, and I think she's writing this from the perspective of a donor as opposed to a staff member. She said, I've made the error about who is a friend/business contact from the perspective of a donor. Yes, the development office of an institution I support was so good at keeping me informed and thanking me that I thought we were friends. But now I understand they were just really good at supporting me as a legacy donor. So, I mean, it is tricky. There is a fine line. And I hope that wasn't sort of a painful realization for you and that it was okay. And I think, then Diana's saying here, it may be the difference between being friendly and friends, right? And so I think there's always that fine line. And I don't know that I have any magical answers or suggestions as to when it's where. But I think, for the most part, it's important to keep the organization front and center of the relationship. And if that's the case, then, your colleagues, and you can be friends with your colleagues or donors, volunteers you're friends with. But most of those relationships probably don't outlast going to the next organization. And I want to make it crystal clear that as fundraisers, those of you that are members of AFP, our code of ethics says that we will never bring donors from one organization to the next. So if you're friends with donors, truly friends, you're not going to be soliciting them for donations for the next organization you go work at. They are strictly donors of the organization that you came from. So I do want to make sure that's crystal clear. Certainly as consultants, we can't take donors from one organization to the next. That would be highly unethical. Nobody would ever work with me or with us if we said, oh, well, I met this, fancy, wealthy person at one organization, and now let's bring them over to the next organization. So there's some real specific rules, and I urge you all to look to the AFP code of ethics for clarification on that if you want some clarification.
Yeah, that actually is interesting because as consultants, one often gets the question from organizations saying, are you going to bring donors to the table? Right? Are you going to bring donors to us? And of course, the answer is no, we are not going to bring donors to you, because if we brought donors to you and to every other organization, right, we and everybody else would be in trouble. It makes no sense at all. So nonetheless, it's a really good idea to have a professional friendship. All of us have professional friendships, right? And Amy, you and I are friends, but we are mainly professional friends. I mean, even looking at that, right? Our ages we're decades apart in age and status in life, and in the places we are in life. Many things are not the same, and yet we are serious friends. It is a professional friendship. If it weren't for our professional stuff, we wouldn't probably come together very often, right? If at all. So that's the kind of friendship one builds with donors, I think. And it is worth paying attention to. Somebody said recently, maybe on one of these calls, that, to be a really good fundraiser, you don't have to love people. You just have to be fascinated by them. And you can actually, I mean, I feel like I love the relationships I have with people I'm fascinated by, even though they may be quite different from me. And, so what does that tell us about how to build a relationship with people in the summer? Part of the quest, part of what you can do is to find out what they're doing in the summer, right? Pick the top 20 donors to your organization and find out what they're doing, right? Reach out to them and say, are you going to be around this summer? Are you going away? Right? I'd love to connect with you while the times are slower, right? Is there a chance we can get together for ice cream? I do like that. I do like that idea. So, I kind of like the idea of picking the top, 20, however many donors there, are sort of, the lead donors in your organization, and reaching out with them simply to say, listen, I'd like to get to know you better this summer. Well, I have a little more time, and perhaps you do too. Can we get together for coffee? Right? Is there any, even if they say, no, I'm sorry, we're going to Europe, you will have moved the relationship ahead by simply suggesting something like that.
Right. And then you can say, well, I hope we can get together after your trip, after you're back. Right. Have a great trip. I can't wait to hear all about it. Right. So I think that's right. I think it's important to think about how you're going to connect with donors at different levels. Right. So Andrea is absolutely right. The top 20, you will have one very personal strategy for. The next 100 in your group, you might have a different strategy for. You might have, I don't know, small gatherings, right? Or, a walk in the park, or, somehow meet the clients if it's appropriate at your organization. It may or may not. So, and then there's going to be a more general strategy for the summer for your base supporters. And so it'll vary, I think, from different donors. So if anybody has suggestions or what you plan to do, go ahead and put it in the chat. All right, Andrea. So let's go to.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Elizabeth asked her question early on. Let's start with that. So there's a little chat in the chat box, but Elizabeth is asking, has anybody gone from public to quiet phase during the pandemic? Is it different than going public in prior campaigns? And I think that there are some important differences, because normally in a public phase, you might have a big event, you might have a big ribbon cutting, you might have a big celebration of some sort to move from the quiet phase to the public phase of your campaign. You might have lots of house parties or gatherings. And certainly during the pandemic, while we know that many organizations did go from the quiet phase to the public phase, and let's just back up for 10 seconds and explain the difference between quiet and public in case anybody needs an update or a refresh. So the quiet phase is really when you're asking your leadership level donors and those closest to your organizations for gifts in one-on-one settings. You haven't done a press release. You haven't done a big public announcement of the goal. You haven't asked anybody in bulk. The public phase is when you go to your base for support, you go to the community. That's when you would do a campaign brochure, perhaps, or a press release, or have events. You might ask on social media and direct mail. So you would do more bulk solicitations. And that's really for the last 30% of your campaign. So in the quiet phase, you'll raise the vast majority of the funds for your campaign, 70, maybe even 80% from individual solicitations one-on-one. So Elizabeth, I'm going to let Andrea chime in just a second here, but I think that the bottom line is that, many organizations, when they get to that 70% of funds raised, sometimes 80%, it is then time to go to the public phase. And it probably did look different. There were less big gatherings. There was more mailings or online events, or I'm happy for suggestions. But Andrea, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, many things seemed different in during COVID. Certainly people got used to doing things virtually. And just like there were many virtual galas or ungalas, as many people called them, there have been virtual campaign kickoffs. One of the things that I've been playing with recently is the idea of having multiple kickoffs, which sounds a little odd, but you can have different kind of kickoffs at different times. So, for example, well, let's look at what a kickoff really does. Let's look at what a campaign kickoff really is. If you sort of shave away everything that doesn't matter, right? What does matter is that when you move from the quiet phase to the public phase of your campaign, you actually decide on your campaign goal. That's what really matters. Then you publish your campaign goal with no apologies and no questions about whether it's going to raise or lower. So that's the essence of what has to happen. Now, you can have kickoff type events when you have a groundbreaking, for example, if you're raising money for a building. And in COVID times, that would mean a socially distanced groundbreaking, but you could probably still do it. You can have, one of my clients had commissioned a new piece that their musicians and students were going to play, and they were going to play it on the land on which the building was going to be built, and they were going to honor the tribes that had inhabited that land, and the piece was written for that effect. They used that as one of their campaign kickoffs. And they created a video of it. It was evidently quite spectacular. I haven't seen it yet. So that was sort of a campaign kickoff in a way. It got people together around the campaign and created a little bit of excitement. They'll probably have another kickoff before all is said and done. So let's say that your kickoff was in the COVID times and you did it through Zoom. Then you would invite your largest donors and your key board members, and you would celebrate how far you've come and all of their roles in that and what the goal is going to be and the timeline going forward, and have a lot of thanking. And you might even send them something in advance so that, you could send them each a bottle of champagne so that they're, open popping champagne or whatever during the kickoff. So I like the idea of not thinking that a campaign kickoff has to be a big, fancy, formal event or one event at all. To think, okay, we can be more relaxed about how we do this. If the campaign kickoff announces the goal and is a time when we build energy, right? That would be something you could do during the summer, right? To bring your donors closer, in fact. We're going to have a special kickoff at the beach.
Listen, I want to make sure everybody's clear. We're talking about kicking off the public phase, not kicking off your campaign, which sometimes the terminology gets a little fuzzy. So certainly you kick off your campaign when you're doing a quiet phase, or maybe even before that. But what we're talking about here is kicking off the public phase when you're asking, the community to support the end of the campaign. All right, let's keep going. Did you have a question picked out that you wanted to answer, Andrea?
Well, let's go to Adrienne's question. Is a feasibility study crucial to the campaign? We have a board member who's saying he thinks it's a waste of time and resources and we should just start fundraising. Our thoughts. We do have thoughts about that. So we think that some sort of feasibility study is important. However, there are a variety of ways that you can do that, right? And one end of the spectrum is simply taking the time to have leaders, to have interviews, have conversations with your largest potential donors to make sure that they are going to be on board, right? You don't want to end up having started your campaign, having simply said we're going to raise $10 million or whatever it is for this building, and not having checked in with your largest donors, only to find out that the largest donors are not as committed or excited about the project as you had hoped they were. That's a negative, for sure. So you don't want to do that. But you could, your executive director, development director, board chair could identify 10 or 15 of your largest donors and go have some conversations. Say, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you think? So that's one option.
So that's what we call sort of a DIY, do-it-yourself donor conversation feasibility study. It's not a formal fundraising feasibility study. It's informal, it's relaxed. And at a minimum, that's what we think you should do. You really don't want to be in a position of going to ask your donors for gifts before you've had a conversation about the campaign with them. It's an engagement technique. It's an engagement tool. So you don't have to, what Andrea is saying, you don't have to do a formal feasibility study, which is probably what your board member thinks is a waste of time, which of course we disagree with. But there is sort of at one end of the spectrum, this do-it-yourself donor conversation version. Okay, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
And at the end of that, of a do-it-yourself set of conversations, you could put together a small report from that, saying we have spoken with our top 15 donors, and here's what we heard. Right? We think that what we heard indicates that we should move ahead with a campaign like this, or that we shouldn't move ahead. We have found a surprising lack of interest among our top donors. We better rethink. So that it will be important to do that. The next thing, and what we mostly recommend to organizations, is doing what we call a guided feasibility study, where you work with us or another consultant. I'm not sure anyone else does this, but we certainly do. Where we guide you through the study process, but you actually do the interviews. You, the development director, the executive director, perhaps a board member, you actually do the interviews, but you do it in a more official way. And we work with you to make sure that the report that comes out of that is credible and follows the standards by which a consultant would have developed a report based on what it is you found. Then we end up co-presenting the report to your board to give confidence to those recommendations. And the third, of course, is to hire a traditional campaign consultant who will help organize the study and do the interviews and then write the report and bring them back to you and your board. So those are the three. It probably is the last of those that your board member is unhappy with. And that's probably because it does cost more money than he or she would like to spend. And they may have had experience where that what they heard back was nothing they didn't already know. So they felt it was a waste of money. So we understand that. All right, what's next, Amy?
All right. So Leah is asking, do I hear that the quiet phase is more productive than the public phase, the one-to-one, and can this be inverted? In that case, what happens? And Leah, the answer is no. For a big campaign, that cannot be inverted. I think what you're asking is, can you do the public phase first, or can you get more money out of the public phase? In either scenario, the answer is no. The quiet phase comes first, and it's where you ask your biggest donors one-on-one. That's how campaigns work. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a $1 million goal, and it doesn't matter if your goal is 10 million or 100 million. The numbers are the same. You have a $1 million goal. So in an ideal campaign, the first donor would give approximately a 20 to 25% gift. So a $200,000 to $250,000 gift. You know, you can do the math. I just can't speak. So once you have your first gift of 200,000 or 250,000, then you ask for your $100,000 gifts and so on down. So by the time you're in the public phase and asking the community, and some members of the community are giving $100 or $200, then if you only have, 50,000 to go, then they can see that their gift actually makes a difference. But if you're starting with $1 million and you're asking the public for gifts and somebody wants to give $100, they don't see any way to get to the $1 million. And there really is no way mathematically, unless, well, I want to say there's no way to get to $1 million unless there's a hurricane and you're the Red Cross. That's the sort of only unless, with $100 gifts. So you have to start with the big gifts and you have to start with the quiet phase. You can't start going to the public with small gifts, and you can't do it first. So hopefully that was clear. Okay. Whose question is next? Are we seeing that? Let's see here.
So somebody said in the chat, perhaps it was, that they wanted to use the summer to do some data mining to learn more about their donors. And I think that's actually a great idea, right? You have time, you have energy, you can actually just breathe a little and do some, we have fancy word, data mining. It really just means that you're going to learn more about your donors. Isn't that what it means? Is that what data mining means? Right. And there are a variety of ways you can do that. Always when we look at fundraising from the capital campaign frame, and I think you should from most every frame, honestly, you're looking to identify the people who could give the most money. Right. That's the most, who was it who said, why do you rob banks? It's because that's where the money is. So really in the fundraising business, you want to be focusing your time and energy on the people who have the capacity to give the largest gifts. One of the best ways to find that out is to find out who in your database has given large gifts to other organizations. Right? Giving tends to be habitual, and you don't want to be in the position of going to try to get $1 million from someone, even though they have a vast amount of money, if they have never before given a gift of more than $100,000. That's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. But you could use the summer months to do a little bit of research and find out who on your donor base actually has given $1 million to other organizations. That's a really important thing to find out, even if you find out nothing else. It's probably more important than knowing a huge amount about how much money they really have. Right? I mean, if I were to pick one piece of information I was looking for, it's give me information about a person's prior giving, because that tells me everything. If a person regularly gives large gifts, first of all, it tells me that they have money. That's all I need to know. I don't need to know what kind of money they have, what they're invested in. I don't need to know whether they're divorced or not divorced or pay alimony. I really don't need to know any of that. It tells me that they have money and that they are generous and that they know how to give large gifts. So in my opinion, looking at where people have given, particularly if you're a community-based organization, right? If you operate in a small town or a city of 50,000 or 100,000 people, and you start looking to see who the givers are in your community, you'll be amazed at how many people give large gifts again and again. It's remarkable. And you know what? You should get to know those people. So if you were to spend your summer only looking for that information in your community, that would put you way ahead of the game, even if you didn't reach out to anybody else. What do you think of that idea, Amy?
I love it. I think it's great. All right, let me go to Sharon. Sharon says, I just finished a feasibility study and it was clear that the organization did not have the support to go ahead with a campaign. They need to spend at least another year getting ready. And so, a lot of times organizations are worried that they're going to do a feasibility study and then it's going to say that they can't do a campaign. And generally, what Sharon's alluding to, it doesn't say that they can't do a campaign. It says that here are the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things that they need to do to get ready for a campaign. And so, don't worry if a feasibility study comes back and says, you can't quite raise the amount of money that you hoped for. Obviously, that's going to be disappointing, but a good feasibility study report should also tell you how to get ready for a campaign or, how to modify your campaign so that you can be successful with a slightly scaled back project. So, generally we don't see feasibility studies that say don't do a campaign, but it may say you need to wait or do these different things first. And I think that that's important.
Kathy Tollefson has asked an interesting question that keys on to a conversation you and I had the other day, Amy, about donor fatigue. So her question is this: a board member is concerned that we are sending requests to donors who don't want to be asked. We ask 3 times a year with lots of thank yous and newsletters in between. I think we're good, but should I do what the board member suggests, that we only ask, we ask each donor if they want a donor request letter? No, don't do that. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. I promise you, if they don't want the donor request letter, they'll just throw it away. Right? It's very easy to throw things away. If it's an email, they'll just toss it, right? It is not an imposition to do that. And honestly, in every request letter, you have an opportunity to tell them something new about the organization. You have an opportunity to ask them something about themselves. Right? You could say, all right, again, you pick the top 20 or 30 people you want to reach, and you fine tune each of those request letters specifically for that person. You can make it more into a communication than just a request. And there's only benefit to get from that. So, but Amy and I were talking with one of our advisors about donor fatigue, which is what your board member is probably talking about.
And the only thing that I would say is that you should sit down with that particular board member and find out why they are concerned about it and how they would like to be approached. Because honestly, they're talking about themselves, which is fine. And you can get to the bottom of that with some good, open-ended, thoughtful questions. All right. Joy's question caught my eye. What if you don't have any 250,000 plus donors? Joy, then you may or may not be able to do $1 million plus campaign. That's the bottom line. And that you have more. Okay, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Wait a minute. Just because someone doesn't give you $250,000 in response to your annual solicitation doesn't mean they might not give you $250,000 in response to a campaign solicitation. So be careful you don't make that mistake. And a lot of people make that mistake. They say, no one's ever given us more than $10,000. All right. Now, the question is, does that mean that they will never give you more than $10,000? No. Does that mean that they can't give you more than $10,000? No. So one of my clients actually recently is in a capital campaign, and there was a donor who had given them, $10,000 or $15,000 a year for a long time. And that donor, he was one of these donors who sort of runs hot and cold, right? He gets tired of organizations. He moves on to something that is more exciting to him. And as I was talking about that donor with my client, I said, why don't you reach out to him and tell him about, tell him what you're up to and tell him what's exciting, and just tell him you want to, he hasn't been giving to you for a while, but you just thought he might like to know, he might find it interesting. So my client calls the guy up and says, you are always telling me that I should pay more attention to money. And I just wanted you to know that I really am paying more attention to money. We're doing this building project. We're raising $10 million. And lo and behold, if the guy didn't say, well, I'll give you $1 million towards your campaign, he had never given more than $15,000, I don't think. So that didn't mean just because that's what his annual fundraising was. What someone's annual fundraising is not always a good predictor of what they have the capacity to do, should they be excited. So be sure you don't make that mistake, Joy.
Excellent. Yeah. You've never asked them for $250,000 before. You've probably just sent them a letter with or without a specific number. But my guess is that you haven't asked for $250,000 yet. So you don't know. Okay. So, Andrea.
Go back to this question. She wants to know, Amy O'Sullivan, what is the best way to start data mining? We use such funny languages, right? People do use that word. I'm not picking on you, Amy. But for a major gifts project, how do you start doing that? And that's a good question. How would you advise, Amy?
Yeah. So, there's lots of companies that help with that. Maybe you and I are looking at different questions from Amy, but, okay. Yes.
Am I reading it wrong?
I don't know. I was reading the question differently, but maybe you're reading it correctly. So to me, listen, there's many companies that help with data mining. And so there's ways that you can look in your own database for the largest donors, the most loyal donors, repeat donors. There's lots of things to look for, but if you're serious about a campaign, a couple of things. One is, I think it's worth it to have your list screened. There's wealth screening companies, and in the chat box, if you want to say if you've used a wealth screening company, and either give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down, whether you'd recommend them or not. But then, take that with a grain of salt. It's a starting point. And then you have to go talk to those donors and talk to people who know those donors and find out if they've given other gifts to other campaigns and how long they've been supporting your organization, what they are passionate about. So, all right. So there's a few people chatting in the chat box, about iWave and Wealth Engine. There's lots of companies that do that kind of thing. And I would ask them, what can you do for me? And can you give me a sample? Okay, go ahead.
Josie asked this question early on, and I just want to briefly respond to it. How can I get in deep touch with a donor? You don't get in deep touch with anyone the first time around. Like any other relationship, it builds over time. So the way to get to know people is to be curious about them, right? Is to be genuinely curious about them, to think they're interesting, to find out what about them is interesting, it's any, if you think about the way you make friends, to go back to, again, I'm not suggesting you make friends with the donor, but the process is the same. You make friends slowly over a period of time as you get to know people better and better. And you develop a relationship and you develop trust and you become more interested in what they're doing and they become more interested in what you're doing. And that's really the same sort of thing that happens with donor relationships. So trust that process, which I'm sure you know well from a personal point of view.
All right, we're going to take a break for just a few minutes, Andrea, and then we're going to get back. There's lots of questions still to answer.
Yes.
I want to remind everybody that we have been doing these toolkit talks for 11 months straight, and we took a break last summer, and we have been doing them prior to that. So we are taking the next 6 weeks off from Toolkit Talks Live, but the podcast will continue. And the podcast for the next 6 weeks is us interviewing the Capital Campaign Toolkit advisors on the hottest topics that they hear about every day with their clients. And so if you love the Toolkit Talks and don't want to miss a beat, I would urge you to check your local podcasting app and check out our podcast. It's called All About Capital Campaigns, and you will continue to hear from us weekly. But if you want to continue to get your questions answered and meet with us in an even more intimate setting and join our weekly Wednesday calls with our members only clients calls, we are offering a summer discount so that you can not miss a beat and continue to chat with us every single week in an even more intimate setting. And the summer discount is Summer 500. If you go to our webpage and want to join the subscription toolkit, you would type in summer, all caps, the number 500. And that'll get you $250 off in July and $250 off in August for a subscription. As we prepare to come back in August with these live weekly toolkit talks, we thought we would ask some questions. So, Andrea, we're going to just spend a few minutes asking you guys, our loyal listeners, questions, and then hopefully we'll have time for a few more of your questions at the end.
Yeah, so we have two kinds of questions, and they're really quite simple. One is, how can we serve? The first type is, how can we serve you better? And then the second type is how you might help us to get an even bigger audience for these things. So let's start out by thinking about how we might serve you better. So let me see, Amy.
All right.
Do you have it?
Yeah. So in the chat, we'd like to hear from you. First of all, what topics would you like to hear from us on these toolkit talks when we pick back up in August and September? What are the topics that you most want to hear about for this toolkit talks and maybe for our blog? So if you could chat in what topics would be great. We're also curious every once in a while, about once every 2 or 3 months, we have a guest join us on the toolkit talks. So we'd love to know who would be great guests, if you'd like us to have more guests, or you think we're doing it just about right, we'd love to hear that too. So get your fingers going. We'd really like to see topics that you want to hear from us, and also who we should bring as guests. Was there one more question we wanted to ask before we dive into the other part of the questions? So we're getting some good suggestions. Setting campaign budgets as a topic, how to do successful donor mapping, year-end solicitations, book reviews or other interviews with authors. Great suggestion. Growing a fundraising culture on your board and overall organization. More about capacity campaigns that don't include bricks and mortar. Susan, we have a great webinar. If you send us an email to support@capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, we can send you a recording of that webinar on capacity campaigns. And fundraising plans to replace the gala. Oh, great topics. Thank you for writing that in. And as ideas come to you, keep putting them in the chat.
Yeah, and if there are any more general, suggestions for us, these, as you know, these conversations really are free flowing based on your questions. Sometimes I wonder if that makes them exciting or if that makes them totally disorganized, or whether that matters. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
All right. Now that we've asked, hopefully those questions go to how can we help you, right? What topics do you want to hear from us? You can also put in the chat, how else can we serve you here at the Capital Campaign Toolkit? Now we'd like to ask for your help. We were wondering a couple of things. We're looking to grow the Capital Campaign Toolkit, and that means spreading the word. So we're hoping that you might think of introducing and sharing the Toolkit Talks, these weekly Monday talks, or our podcast all about capital campaigns, with your board members and the leaders of your team. So if you would do us a favor and send out a link encouraging the leaders at your organization to join us, and also thinking about introducing us to someone in your sector. If you're with a theater group, is there a theater alliance? Or if you're with a school, CASE or CASE NACE, how can we raise the visibility of the toolkit in your sector? What's another example? Animal shelters. We work with a lot of animal organizations, animal welfare organizations. So if there's a way to share these toolkit talks or our podcast or do a webinar for any of those groups, we would really appreciate it. Did I miss anything, Andrea?
No, I think you were terrific, Amy.
Excellent. All right. So keep those ideas coming. Let's get back to the questions. We've still got some questions to answer in the Q&A box.
Yeah. So actually, Sharon has suggested that she'd like to have a well-known speaker in the field once a month. And if any of you have somebody that you heard and you thought was just terrific, right? Let us know. We'd be happy to reach out to them. We can probably get most anybody if we put our minds to it. So if you want someone, if you have someone specific you'd like to suggest, that would be great. All right. Let's see. All right. Dr. Coleman has asked this question. It has been said that friendship precedes finances. How do you handle the case where the friendship building takes much longer than the organization wants? The friendship it doesn't go as fast as the need for finances goes. I think that's what you're after. They need money, but they don't have the time to build the friendships to get it. And there's really a simple answer to that. It's not a happy answer, but the simple answer is this: that if you let the finances get ahead of the friendships, you will be disappointed in the finances. That's the answer. That the world has a way of righting itself, of forcing you to do that. Now, there is some slight nuance to that. And every once in a while, someone who has a reason to be interested in the success of your organization and who may not have been directly involved will make a significant gift without having a close relationship with you. So, for example, there are, in my experience, in many communities, there are a few donors who really want to support the organizations in that community. They don't want to serve on their boards often, right? But they want the organizations to move forward. And they may give a significant contribution to your organization because of the role you play in the community you serve, and because the community's interest is of interest to that donor. So sometimes there's a little more leeway and latitude than you might imagine. It's not always the case, but sometimes.
All right, let me answer that in a slightly different way. Of course, I agree with everything you said, Andrea, but also sometimes organizations wait too long to ask for donors because they're trying to get the mega gift or the ultimate gift or the biggest gift they can. And I think that that's a mistake too. Often when you're developing relationships with new donors, it's perfectly appropriate and necessary to ask for a slightly smaller gift or a gift that matches the current relationship with that particular donor. Maybe they will start with $1,000 gift and you think they could give $100,000, but right now you don't have a $100,000 relationship with that donor, or you're not doing, a capital campaign, or maybe you're about to. First, get them in the habit of giving to your organization and get in the habit of thanking them and showing them what you do with their slightly smaller gifts, and work up to that big donation. So don't worry about getting the biggest gift you can the first time you ask a donor for for a gift. Just start getting them in the habit of giving to your organization so that you can start growing that donor relationship. So
Yes, and so Dr. Coleman was the person who also asked about feasibility studies. And one of the reasons to do feasibility studies is that it gives you a structure and a context within which to begin talking to large donors in your community with whom you might not yet have a big, strong relationship. So talking to those donors is one way to begin to build some kind of a partnership or a friendly relationship that might well lead to their involvement in your campaign and might well lead to a larger gift. So it doesn't make sense to say we don't want to do a feasibility study. We only want to ask for money, right? You have to say, well, feasibility study is a wonderful way for us to begin some of the relationships, building some of the relationships we need to build. So your two questions are related. And thank you for asking them.
Excellent. Sharon, can you do us a favor and put the names of your suggested speakers in the chat box and not in the Q&A box? I don't know if we're going to get the recorded answers of the Q&A box. I do know we're going to be able to monitor the chat box after this conversation, and I don't want to lose out on those good suggestions for speakers. Thank you. Okay. I think we have time for one or two more. Let's see. All right. Meredith's asking about how to reconnect with lapsed donors, particularly donors who made a gift by donating unused program fees for things like after school and summer camp programming. Good question, Meredith. I think that, first of all, if they donated their program fees, last year, maybe at the YMCA, they weren't able to come in, but they donated their membership fees. I think that's an example of something that you're talking about. I don't even know if I would consider them lapsed, right? They have given this past year. And so go back to them. Now they're able to come back and use your services. Your examples were after school program or summer camp programming. Go back to them and say, listen, we're up and running. These are the changes that we've made. This is why we need support, and get in touch with them like you would any other donor. But to me, if they made a gift by donating last year, they're not lapsed yet. So make sure they don't lapse and go back and have a conversation with them. Let them know if your programs and services have changed, what you're doing, why it costs even more this year to provide safe programming, and ask for the next gift. Is there another question that caught your eye, Andrea?
Well, there was a question about, do we know any resources about how to ask questions? And I'm just looking for it in my bookshelf, but I can't see it off the top of my head right here. Jerry Panis co-authored with someone else a book on asking questions. It wasn't my favorite book, but it'll point you in the right direction. So look under Jerry Panis, Panas, and question asking, and you will find the title of a book that he wrote. And more generally, there's actually a fair amount written about asking questions, not specific to fundraising, but a Google search will take you to some really good resources, both books and blog posts and articles. There is, like anything else, it's not rocket science, but there is stuff to know, and there are things you should practice. I will give you one really simple tip, though, one I've learned over the years. The way to ask most questions is to start with the word how or what. If you start with the words how or what, you are guaranteed to ask an open-ended question, and that will begin a conversation. Right? If I ask Amy, how are you getting to the airport today, Amy? She can't say yes or no as an answer to that. Right? She's gonna tell me. Right?
I would add why to that. I'm trying to think.
Why is good also. Why sometimes makes people defensive. Right. So you have to be a little careful with why. It does work. It leads to open-ended questions. But how or what are the gold standard in that?
So let's give a concrete example of that. So if I ask a donor, do you like our organization? That leads to yes or no, and that's a closed question. But if you say, what do you like about our organization? That leads to a conversation, and that's what Andrea is talking about here. I can't think of the name of the book either, but I've written a blog post about it. My favorite book on questions, the question is, what would you do if you could not fail? Now, that may or may not be a question that you want to ask each and every donor, but I think it's a good question to ask yourself before you go and talk to donors. What would you do if you could not fail, right? How would you, not that I want you to be cocky or arrogant with your donors, but be brave, right? What would you do if you couldn't fail? Go for that campaign. Go out and talk to donors. If anybody knows what book I'm talking about, I can share it later. I can't think of who wrote it. All right. Wrap up thoughts. Andrea, let's wrap this up for the summer, and we will see everybody in 6 weeks. In the middle of August, we will be back. We're super excited about taking our break, but also having everybody listen to the podcast all summer, where for the next 6 weeks, we interview our regular campaign advisors here at the Capital Campaign Toolkit on the most exciting topics that they have on their minds about capital campaigns these days.
So thanks to Gary Bukowski for filling in the title of the book that I was suggesting, which is Power Questions by Andrew Sobel and Jerry Panis. So thank you for that, Gary. Nice to see you on the call today. Let's take just the last couple of minutes, Amy, and tell everybody how amazing they are. Yeah. How your questions and suggestions and willingness to sort of, flow with us is so empowering for us. And so, your willingness to tolerate us when we go in directions that may not be right, or when we don't interpret your questions properly, or when one of us says things that the other has to stop them on. I mean, it's really wonderful to have built trust with you. And that's really what I feel like we have, that we trust you to ask good questions and to hold us accountable in some ways when we need to be held accountable, or to suggest what works or what doesn't work, and to lend us your wisdom in the chat. And that's a wonderful thing. We appreciate it. It's heartwarming, actually. Don't you think, Amy?
It is. these toolkit talks have become some of our favorite parts of our week. So thank you for joining us each and every week. We will be back in 6 weeks in the middle of August. You'll get an email when we're ready to start up again. But in the meantime, we do hope you'll join us at All About Capital Campaigns on your favorite podcasting app. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great summer. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining Amy and Andrea for today's All About Capital Campaigns. To learn more about them and their work together, go to capitalcampaigntoolkit.com.